Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, last year, my family and I had the opportunity to visit the United Kingdom. We went to London, to York, and then finally to several places in Scotland. Our first stop in Scotland was the city of Edinburgh, which has an amazing amount of history, and one of the most historic places to visit there is Edinburgh Castle. And it was there at Edinburgh Castle that we learned about the story that we're going to take a look at today, which is the Black Dinner. And some people feel that the Black Dinner became one of the inspirations for George R.R. Martin, who wrote Game of Thrones, for the infamous Red Wedding, which takes place in Game of Thrones. I won't give too much away, but basically it involves a whole bunch of people, guests at a wedding, at a dinner after the wedding, and they're all slaughtered. And we know that George R.R. Martin definitely did receive inspiration from different areas of history, and so that might include this particular part of history. So with that in mind, I want to say thank you to Dan in Glen Ellen, Illinois, and Sebastian in Miami, Florida. Thank you guys so much for your support on Patreon. We're going to take a look at the story of the Black Dinner from our friends at Extra History. The link is in the description if you want to check it out without my commentary. Let's go ahead and dive in.
Friars Priory, Scotland, February 20th, 1437. King James I of Scotland reclines in a bedchamber with his wife Joan of Beaufort and her servants, relaxing after a hard day of tennis, when suddenly there's a commotion outside, and the royal couple rises to discover a large group of men storming the building. James hurries to lock the door, but finds the bar missing. He then tries the windows, but they won't open. Oh no, has his bedchamber been tampered with? Oh, it had. And at that moment, his trusted chamberlain is leading a group of assassins to the room. Desperate, James pries up a floorboard and attempts to scramble into a sewer he knows runs below. Meanwhile, at the door, servants try to delay the assassins. One even places her arm in the rung of the locking bar, but the attackers slam against the door until her arm snaps, forcing it open. They spot the broken floorboards easily. Meanwhile, down in the sewer, the king despairs as he's now trapped. He'd forgotten he'd ordered the drain blocked, because he kept losing tennis balls down it. And there, the King of Scotland dies, and the chain of revenge is set.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the Stewarts, who are the kings of Scotland at this point. Within a couple generations after Robert the Bruce, the Stewarts come to the throne of Scotland, and they remain the dynasty that rules Scotland until the crowns join between England and Scotland when King James VI of Scotland becomes King James I of England. But I want to show you a little bit of their history. So the Stuart line begins with Robert II, who's a grandson of Robert I, Robert the Bruce. And things are okay for a little while, but see, he's 74 when he dies, so he has a nice, long life. Robert III, same deal. He's almost 70 years old when he dies. It's when you get to the Jameses that things start to go wrong. So James I is the guy we're talking about now. He's 42 when he is killed. And it does not get much better after that. His son, James II, is only 29 when he dies, killed by an exploding cannon at Roxburgh Castle in 1460. And then his son is James III, who is only 36 when he dies, killed in battle following a rebellion. His son, James IV, these guys are all my ancestors, by the way, so take a drink. I'm descended from an illegitimate daughter of James IV. So James IV dies at the age of 40, the last monarch of Great Britain to be killed at battle. He's killed at the Battle of Flodden, fighting against the English. And then his son is James V of Scotland, who's only 30 when he dies. He died after the Scottish defeat at the Battle of Solway Moss. And then, of course, his daughter, 6 days old at the time of his death, is Mary, Queen of Scots, who, of course, herself is beheaded. So that gives you a sense of the line of Stuart monarchs and how very badly things went for them for a really long time.
Thanks so much to Factor for keeping us fed on a busy schedule. If you like tales of political intrigue, mafia-style clans, cold-blooded murders, and hot-blooded reprisals, you, my friends, have come to the right place. Because today, we're going to look at the Black Dinner.
there's a lot of those kinds of stories in Scotland, right? The clan warfare, and that stuff transported itself to America too. I've talked about this in other videos, but if you're not familiar with it, a lot of the southern part of the United States was settled by what we call Scots-Irish. They were people from Scotland and then Scottish people who lived in Ireland for a while and then came to the United States. And a lot of that kind of clan mentality and that individuality and that mistrust of governmental authority exists to this day. And a lot of what we see with things like the Hatfields and the McCoys, right? The clan warfare. And there were way more violent clan warfare actions than the Hatfields and the McCoys. My great-grandmother was a Holbrook, and the Holbrook-Underwood feud in Kentucky was worse than the Hatfields and the McCoys. But that goes right back to the Scottish clans.
The infamously brutal event that was the historical inspiration for the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones. But to tell that sort of tale, we need to get the setting right. So, think of a harsh landscape of castles and wilderness, racked by political feuds, and populated by powerful families not afraid to get their hands bloody. Welcome, in other words, to late medieval Scotland. As we covered up top, in 1437, a rival political faction murdered King James I in the sewer below Blackfriars Priory. But the assassins made one basic mistake. They didn't kill James's wife, Joan of Beaufort. Though injured, she somehow survived and escaped. And funny enough...
And she's a part of the English royal family.
The ex-Miss Stewart was, let's just say, less than thrilled about her injuries and the murder of her beloved husband. So, as soon as she was able, she put out a hit of her own on the assassins. And, just so we can speed through this story's appetizer and get to the main course, this is where we cue a lot of dead assassins. But while Joan got her revenge, her son James II was still a child. In fact, he'd only turned 7 the day after his father's sewer killing, and was therefore too young to assume the throne. No big deal, though. The young James and his mother were allied with Archibald Douglas, 5th Earl of Douglas.
And the Douglases, you've got some really powerful noble families in Scotland, but the Stewarts, the Douglases are among those. The Hamiltons later on will become a very powerful family in Scotland.
Famed as the Black Douglases, the Douglas clan were the most powerful noble family in Scotland. They'd risen to prominence in the early 14th century as loyal supporters of Robert the Bruce.
Yeah, if you've seen the movie Outlaw King, and if you haven't, what are you waiting for? It's fantastic. With Chris Pine as Robert the Bruce. Some liberties with history like most movies do, but Douglas, the Black Douglas, is a prominent character in that.
The king who bested the English in Scotland's War of Independence. Ever since then, the Douglases had been acquiring land and prestige, expanding their power base in southern Scotland. So basically, they were the last family you wanted to make an enemy of, and the first one you wanted on your side, especially if you were a vulnerable boy king. And Archibald Douglas would have surely kept young James safe and, compliant with his own interests, were it not for one small problem. In 1439, 2 years after James II became nominal king, Archibald died from a fever. His heir was William Douglas, who was himself only 15 years old and hardly a fit guardian for the young James. So in swooped the enemies of James II and his mother Joan, specifically one William Crichton, the powerful Lord Chancellor of Scotland. Crichton essentially
If you look at the history of places like England and Scotland, and it's not unique to them, those are just the ones I know the best. Anytime you have a child on the throne, there's trouble. There's trouble because you have people who are not the monarch competing to run the country while the monarch is not of age. It's kind of open season. You didn't dare do that to the monarch. You wouldn't challenge. I mean, sometimes you did, but rarely would you challenge the monarch directly. But you had no trouble challenging people who ruled on his behalf. They were fair game.
Kidnapped James, saying he would be the young king's new guardian until he came of age. In reality, though, Crichton kept James as a comfortable prisoner in Edinburgh Castle, a brooding stronghold that perched atop the rocky crag overlooking Scotland's capital. You said it, bud. Anyway, in 1440...
It's built on the extinct remains of a volcano. Most of that part of Edinburgh is, but it really does. It's so prominent over the rest of the surrounding landscape. You can get incredible views from up there.
The young William Douglas received an unexpected summons. James II, with permission from his so-called guardian Crichton, had invited him for dinner. As was customary, the Douglases were promised safe passage. Attending feasts was a common way for the nobility of the period to meet, interact, and conduct the business of state. So both the 16-year-old William Douglas and his younger brother, the 12-year-old David Douglas, accepted the offer, setting off through the wind and rain of a Scottish winter. Edinburgh Castle, November 24th, 1440. The great hall resounds with merriment and feasting. The wine is flowing, the hearth is glowing, and the first main courses have already been consumed. At the high table, the young King James is playing host to the two other youths, the brothers William and David Douglas. And James is enamored by the pair, enjoying their company. None have the first inkling as to what's about to happen.
And see, that's an important part of this. James doesn't know. To our knowledge, James has no idea what's going on. He is being used as a pawn in this as much as anything else. And he's pretty horrified when he sees what happens next.
Servants begin to carry out the feast's main course, but as the crowd catches sight of it, the sounds of excitement and rejoicing fade, and the courtly music goes silent. The food, placed before William and David Douglas, is no tasty delicacy, but rather the severed head of a black bull. King James and the young Douglases stare at it in shock, all knowing the symbolism. For in Scotland, the head of a black bull is an omen symbolizing one thing: death. Shouts and screams break the edgy silence as men grab William and David. James rises too, protesting voraciously, but he's ignored. Helpless, and their pleas unheard, the two young guests are dragged out of the feasting hall. At William Crichton's command, William and David Douglas are hauled to Edinburgh's place of execution on Castle Hill. Given a brief mock trial, they're found guilty of plotting against the very king who, moments before, had been enjoying their company.
They executed teenagers, well, a teenager and a 12-year-old, for plotting against the king. This, like many such executions in medieval times, had nothing to do with a real plot.
And without more words, the two boys are beheaded. The killings shocked Scotland, not only as acts of infanticide, but also because they violated the customs of hospitality that underpinned medieval Scottish life. To invite a fellow noble into your hall was to promise them safety and protection. Therefore, the murder of the young Douglases was a betrayal of the highest order. But just who ordered it, and why? Of course, as the public face of the killings, William Crichton was obviously involved, but he wasn't the only one.
No.
There were other nobles with
if you're somebody, even the Lord Chancellor, you don't pull off something like this without powerful support, because there's going to be reprisals upon reprisals, and it's going to go back and forth, right? And so you need to be in a strong position to pull this off, so when the inevitable backlash comes, you are protected against it.
To be made following the deaths of William and David Douglas, and none more so than the boys' great uncle, James Douglas. Yep, as in any good story of medieval intrigue, it was likely the scheming uncle who was behind it all along. James Douglas, known as James the Gross, stood to inherit the lands and titles in the event of his nephew's sudden demise. We assume the plan for what would become known as the Black Dinner was subsequently hatched with Crichton and possibly a few others, though they covered their tracks well, likely in secret meetings with furtive messages to leave no hard clues about their involvement. But in truth, the outcome showed James Douglas's hand clearly enough. Once the unfortunate boys met their end and were disposed of in an unmarked Edinburgh grave, James the Gross became the 7th Earl of Douglas and one of the most powerful men in Scotland.
And there's a lot of parallels between this and what happens with what we know as the Princes in the Tower. About 40 years later, 45 years later after this, when you have King Edward V and his brother, Richard, the Duke of York, who are the two sons of Edward IV. When Edward IV dies, Edward V becomes king, but then his uncle, Richard III, who's the Duke of Gloucester, usurps the crown and has the boys thrown into the tower. They're 12 and 10 at the time, and then they kind of just eventually disappear because they were inconvenient, and nobody really knows 100% for sure what happened to them, but it's not without precedent offing young boys so that you can take the throne as an adult.
But now you might be asking, just how much of the detail in this story is true? Well, as with so much from this period, it's hard to be absolutely certain. The closest we've come to a primary source is the Auchinleck Chronicle, which says only that William Douglas and his younger brother David were put to deed, or put to death. Whether there was a treacherous dinner featuring a bull's head isn't mentioned. However, later medieval and Renaissance writers started to include it in their histories, sometimes describing the animal omen as a black boar instead, and the account was cemented by famed author Sir Walter Scott, whose 19th century novels essentially created the medieval Scotland we imagine today. But whatever the truth of that night, the Douglas brothers' murder seemed to have a lasting effect on the young King James II.
And here's what I'll say about that. Did it happen? But at least my experience has been when you have stories like this, there's usually some reason. Like, they don't often get invented out of thin air. Somebody at some point believed that's what happened, and that's how it ended up getting written down. Whether it really did or whether it's an embellished version of what really happened, so hard to say. Because nobody's going to come out and say, yeah, this is what we did. We served a black boar's head, and then we executed a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old so that their great uncle could take their seat of power.
He survived his troubled upbringing and eventually turned the tables on the villainous James Douglas's son. Fittingly, King James II invited William Douglas, son and inheritor of the murderous James Douglas, to a feast in Stirling Castle in 1452, 12 years after the Black Dinner of Edinburgh.
And in what universe would you possibly say yes to this after what happened?
During the banquet, James and a number of other men sprung up and attacked Douglas, stabbing him 26 times before they, according to the Auchinleck Chronicle, struck his brains out with a poleaxe and tossed his body out a window. It seemed the ghosts of William and David Douglas finally had their revenge on the family of their treacherous great uncle. The Black Dinner has made for a dark, compelling story for over 5 centuries, a blend of fact with a likely pinch of fiction. And like all dramatic historical events, it spawned other tales, including some taking place in the realms of the fantastic. And Scotland is rife with such stories, weaving a rich tapestry that runs from the past into the present. And whether the exact details of the Black Dinner are true or not, one thing is for sure. Today in Scotland, severed bull's head remains decidedly off the menu.
So that was an interesting short story, a little bit of interesting background into why you end up with the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones. And so much of Game of Thrones is, as I said before, based on real history, things like the Wars of the Roses and other stuff like that. So thank you guys so much. I want to give a shout out to Cameron in Omaha, Nebraska, Nick in Wheaton, Illinois. Thank you so much for your support on Patreon. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.